The alarm on my wrist buzzed at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something had gone wrong. Not the usual wrong, not a supply delay or a diplomatic complaint. This was the kind of buzz that meant people were dying somewhere among the stars, and I was the one who had to answer for it. My name is Elias Voss, and for the last 6 years I have been the only human allowed to speak inside the Galactic Council chamber. I earned that seat by being patient. I earned it by smiling when I wanted to shout, by nodding when I wanted to argue, and by accepting insults dressed up as compliments from beings who had never once looked at Earth as anything more than a curiosity. They called us a Tier 3 emergent species. That was the polite version. Behind closed doors, some of them called us primitive. A few called us dangerous, but only in the way you might call a child holding scissors dangerous. Something to be watched, not respected. I remember my first day in that chamber, 15 years ago, standing beneath a domed ceiling that stretched taller than any cathedral on Earth, surrounded by delegates from species that had been flying between stars since before humans learned to write. They spoke in calm, measured voices about trade routes and resource quotas, about which corner of the galaxy belonged to which empire, and somewhere in the middle of all that, almost as an afterthought, they decided what crumbs Earth would be allowed to keep. I sat there and said nothing, because arguing would have proven their point. It would have shown them a species too proud and too weak to accept its place. So I swallowed it. Every meeting, every year, I let them believe we were harmless. What they did not know, what none of them ever bothered to ask, was what humanity was doing back home while their attention was fixed on empires 10 times our size. Earth is a small, unimportant world if you judge it by the numbers the Council likes to use. 1 sun, 1 moon, a population spread across a single planet instead of a dozen colonies. By their measurements, we barely registered, but numbers never told the story of what kind of species we actually are. We are the species that fought 2 world wars within a single century and came out the other side building rockets instead of building graves. We are the species that split the atom before we had fully explored our own ocean floors. We argue with each other more than almost any species in the galaxy, yet somehow, when something threatens us all at once, we stop arguing and start building. And while the Council debated whether to allow Earth a seat at their trade summits, we were building. Not palaces, not monuments, shipyards. I flew home twice a year, officially to consult with Earth's government about diplomatic matters, but really to walk through hangars the size of small cities, watching hulls take shape under floodlights that never went dark. I watched engineers argue over reactor designs the way other people argue over sports. I watched veterans, men and women who had fought in Earth's last real war, quietly recruited into training programs that did not exist on any public record. One of those engineers was a woman named Grace Whitfield. She led the propulsion division at the Cheyenne shipyard, and she had a habit of chewing on the end of a pencil while she stared at diagrams, like the answer to some impossible problem was hiding behind her teeth. The first time I met her, she looked up at me and said, without any greeting at all, that the aliens' shield technology had a flaw nobody outside Earth had noticed yet. I asked her how she knew that. She said humans had spent 100 years building weapons to break through armor, and old habits die hard. That conversation stuck with me for years, because it captured something the Council never understood about us. They measured strength in the size of a fleet, or the age of an empire. We measured it in how fast we could learn, how fast we could adapt, and how much we refused to accept being told no. There was a man named Daniel Marsh, a quiet officer who ran simulations day and night in a bunker beneath the Rockies, wargaming battles against alien fleets, using nothing but data we had gathered through 15 years of forced politeness. Every insult thrown at a human diplomat, every dismissive comment made in a council session, every technical detail an alien officer let slip during trade negotiations, all of it ended up in Daniel's files. He built models of enemy ships from scraps of information nobody else thought was worth remembering. I used to ask him why he bothered, since Earth had never gone to war with anyone beyond our own solar system. He told me that peace was just a pause, and history had never once been kind to the side that stopped preparing during the pause. I did not fully understand what he meant until the day everything changed. There was a colony called Kepler's Rest, a mining settlement on the edge of human territory, home to 12,000 people who spent their days pulling rare minerals out of frozen rock so Earth could keep building. It was a quiet place. Families lived there. Children went to school in domes built to withstand meteor storms, but never designed to withstand anything worse. The council had territory near that colony, controlled by an empire called the Vashtar Dominion, a species with a long and proud military history, the kind of history that came with a taste for making examples out of smaller species who did not know their place. A dispute broke out over mining rights in a region called the Kesh Corridor. It should have been settled with paperwork and patience, the way these things were always supposed to be settled according to council law. Instead, the Vashtar decided that Earth needed a lesson in respect. I was sitting in my office on Earth when the first message came through, and I remember every detail of that moment more clearly than I remember most of my own life. The transmission was short, a distress call, cut off halfway through a sentence. Then silence. I called the council immediately, demanding information, demanding an explanation, demanding anything at all. For 6 hours, nobody answered. When they finally did answer, the Vashtar representative did not apologize. He explained, calmly, as though reading from a script, that the colony had violated compliance protocols regarding resource extraction, and that appropriate corrective action had been taken. I asked him what that meant. He told me the colony no longer existed. I sat there in silence, staring at a screen that showed nothing but a calm alien face, completely unbothered by what he had just said, as though he were reporting a change in weather instead of the loss of 12,000 human lives. Something inside me went very quiet in that moment. Not numb, quiet, the way the ocean goes quiet right before a storm breaks. I did not shout. I did not argue. I simply ended the call, walked out of my office, and made one phone call of my own, back to Earth, to a number that only a handful of people in the galaxy even knew existed. I said 4 words. It is time. On the other end of that call, I heard a long breath, and then a single word in reply. Understood. For 15 years, we had let the galaxy believe we were harmless, patient, small. We had smiled through insults and nodded through dismissals, building quietly in the shadows of empires who never once imagined that the species they overlooked might be the one preparing for exactly this moment. The Vashtar Dominion had just made a mistake they did not yet understand. They had assumed silence meant weakness. They were about to learn what silence had actually been hiding. I flew back to Earth that same night, and as my shuttle broke through the atmosphere, descending toward the Cheyenne shipyard, I looked out the window and saw something I had never seen before in all my years of traveling between the stars. Lights. Thousands of them, stretching across the desert floor, illuminating hulls that had been hidden under construction domes for years, ships that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed, engines beginning to hum to life all at once, like a heartbeat finally allowed to beat at full strength after years of being forced to stay slow and quiet. Grace Whitfield met me on the landing platform, no longer chewing on a pencil, her eyes sharp and focused in a way I had never seen before. Daniel Marsh stood beside her, holding a tablet full of simulations that were no longer theoretical. Neither of them said anything about what had happened at Kepler's Rest. They did not need to. Everyone on that platform already knew. Grace looked at me and asked only one question. Are we really doing this? I looked past her, at the fleet lighting up the desert night, ships built in silence for exactly this moment, crewed by people who had spent years training for a war nobody outside Earth believed we were capable of fighting. I told her yes. She nodded once, turned toward the nearest ship, and walked away without another word, because there was nothing left to say. The plans had already been made. The ships had already been built. The only thing left now was to use them. I stood there a moment longer, staring up at a fleet the Galactic Council had no idea existed, thinking about every meeting where they had spoken over me, every year I had swallowed their condescension, every moment I had let them believe humanity would always stay small and quiet, and grateful for whatever scraps they allowed us. They had no idea what was coming, and for the first time in 15 years I did not feel like smiling through it anymore. I felt like walking into that chamber and making sure they never underestimated us again. The desert air smelled like ozone and hot metal as I walked between the ships, and every step felt heavier than the last, because I finally understood what all those years of quiet preparation had actually been building toward. This was not a drill. This was not a simulation running on Daniel Marsh's screens deep beneath the Rockies. This was real, and there was no undoing what was about to happen. I found Oliver Grant standing in the command tower overlooking the launch field, a man who had spent 30 years in Earth's military before most people even knew there was a secret fleet being built. He had the kind of face that never seemed surprised by anything, weathered by decades of hard decisions, but when I stepped into that tower, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen there before. Not fear, something closer to grief held tightly in check. He turned to me and said that Kepler's Rest had been home to his sister. I did not know what to say to that. There was nothing to say. I simply stood beside him and looked out at the fleet, because sometimes the only comfort you can offer someone is your presence, not your words. He told me that Laura Bennett, a young engineer who had been stationed at the colony helping design the settlement's shield grid, had managed to send one final message before the transmission cut out. It was not a distress call. It was a message meant only for her family, recorded in the last few seconds she had, her voice steady even as the world around her fell apart. Oliver played it for me, and I will never forget the words. She said that she was not afraid, because she knew Earth would not let this be forgotten, and she asked whoever heard the message to make sure her nieces grew up in a galaxy that respected human lives as much as it respected human labor and human minerals and human silence. I stood there in that tower with tears in my eyes, and I made a promise to myself in that moment that I intended to keep no matter what it cost. Word of Kepler's Rest spread through Earth within hours, and I watched, from thousands of kilometers above the planet, as news feeds lit up with a grief that quickly hardened into something else entirely. Not panic, not despair, resolve. Governments that had spent years arguing over budgets and borders suddenly found themselves in agreement about exactly one thing, and for the first time in human history, every major nation on Earth authorized the full activation of a joint military project that had been kept secret from the public and from the Galactic Council alike. They called it Project Longbow. I had heard whispers of the name over the years, mentioned only in the most secure briefings, but I never fully understood its scope until Daniel Marsh sat me down in a briefing room and walked me through 15 years of work, condensed into a single presentation. He explained that Project Longbow was not simply about building bigger ships or stronger weapons. It was about understanding an entire galaxy's worth of military doctrine and finding the cracks in it. Every alien fleet that had ever passed near human territory had been observed, measured, and studied. Every technical specification revealed during trade negotiations had been analyzed by teams working around the clock. Every insult thrown at a human diplomat by an alien officer who assumed we were too primitive to understand technical jargon had been recorded and cross-referenced against known engineering principles. Daniel showed me diagrams of Vashtar shield technology, the same technology Grace Whitfield had once told me had a flaw nobody outside Earth had noticed. He explained that their shields were designed to disperse energy weapons efficiently, a system that had served them well for centuries against other species who relied primarily on lasers and plasma cannons. But humanity had never abandoned kinetic weapons the way most of the galaxy had. We still believed in the value of solid mass moving at extreme velocity, a philosophy considered old-fashioned by species who had grown comfortable relying entirely on energy-based combat. Their shields were not designed to handle that kind of impact efficiently, and our ships had been built from the ground up to exploit exactly that weakness. He explained boarding tactics next, something almost unheard of in modern galactic warfare, where most conflicts were settled entirely through long-range exchanges of fire between ships that never came close enough to risk direct contact. Humanity, however, had centuries of experience with close combat that no other species in the galaxy could match, refined across countless conflicts on our own world. Our ships were equipped to breach enemy hulls and deploy trained soldiers directly into the heart of an enemy vessel, a tactic considered barbaric by galactic standards, but devastatingly effective against crews who had never trained to defend against it. He finished by showing me something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and unease. An artificial intelligence system developed in complete secrecy, designed to coordinate swarm tactics across an entire fleet in real time, learning and adapting mid-battle faster than any organic mind could process. It had been trained on centuries of human military history, drawing lessons from conflicts across every continent on Earth, refined by strategists who understood that war was not a game of honor but a brutal test of adaptability. I asked him if he believed it would be enough. He told me that the Vashtar Dominion had never fought an enemy who refused to fight fair, because every species in the Council followed unspoken rules of engagement designed to keep conflicts contained and predictable. Humanity had never agreed to those rules. We had simply been too polite to say so out loud. That night, I stood on the observation deck of a ship called the Valiant, watching engineers make final preparations before departure. Grace Whitfield walked the length of the hangar, inspecting weapon systems personally, refusing to trust the readiness reports of anyone she had not verified herself. Nathan Cole, a young pilot who had transferred from Earth's Atmospheric Defense Corps, sat in the cockpit of a fighter craft, running through pre-flight checks with a calm focus that betrayed nothing of the nerves I imagined he must have felt. I found myself thinking about the council chamber, about the calm alien face that had told me 12,000 people no longer existed, as though reporting nothing more than a change in inventory. I thought about years of swallowed insults, about diplomatic smiles I had forced onto my face, while listening to species far younger to true wisdom than they believed themselves to be, lecture humanity about our place in their galaxy. I thought about Laura Bennett's final message, about nieces who deserved to grow up somewhere that valued human life as much as human labor. Oliver Grant found me standing there and asked if I intended to accompany the fleet into battle, since my role as a diplomat did not require me to place myself in danger. I told him that I had spent 15 years speaking for humanity, in rooms full of people who never truly listened. I intended to be present for the moment they finally did. He studied me for a long moment before nodding, understanding something in my decision that did not require further explanation. As dawn broke over the shipyard, the fleet began its final preparations for departure. I walked the corridors of the Valiant, passing crew members checking systems, soldiers reviewing boarding protocols, engineers making last adjustments to weapon calibrations. Nobody spoke much. There was a heaviness in the air, not fear exactly, but the particular silence that settles over people who understand they are about to do something that cannot be undone. Grace found me near the bridge and handed me a datapad showing final battle simulations Daniel had run overnight. She explained that based on everything they knew about Vashtar fleet composition and their standard defensive patterns near the Kesh corridor, our fleet had a strong probability of overwhelming their forces if we struck quickly, before they had time to properly organize a coordinated response. I asked her what happened if the simulations were wrong. She looked at me steadily and said that humanity had never once let a bad simulation stop us from trying, because sometimes the only way to know what a species is truly capable of is to stop calculating the odds and start moving forward anyway. I thought that was, in its own way, the most honest description of humanity I had ever heard. The Valiant's engines came online with a deep hum that I felt through the floor beneath my boots, a sound that seemed to echo through every corridor of the ship simultaneously, as though the vessel itself was drawing a long breath before the fight ahead. Oliver Grant's voice came over the ship's intercom, calm and steady despite everything I knew he carried with him, informing the crew that departure was set for 0600 hours, that our destination was the Kesh corridor, and that our mission was not simply retaliation, but a message that needed to be delivered clearly enough that no species in the galaxy would ever again mistake human patience for human weakness. I stood at the viewport as the shipyard doors opened, revealing the vast darkness of space beyond, dotted with stars that had watched over Earth for billions of years, indifferent to everything happening on the surface below. Somewhere beyond those stars, the Vashtar Dominion was going about its business, confident in its strength, unaware that the species it had just attacked was not the harmless, primitive world they believed us to be. They thought silence meant weakness. They were about to discover exactly what that silence had been building. As the Valiant broke away from the shipyard, joining a fleet of ships the galaxy did not know existed. I felt something settle inside me that had been missing for 15 years of careful diplomacy and swallowed pride. Certainty. We were no longer a species waiting patiently for permission to exist among the stars. We were coming to collect a debt, and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop us from delivering it. The Kesh corridor stretched out before us like a river of stars, a narrow passage between two massive asteroid fields that the Vashtar Dominion had claimed as their own territory for over a century. As the Valiant led our fleet through the final approach, I stood on the bridge beside Oliver Grant, watching sensor readings populate across the main display, each one representing a Vashtar warship stationed to defend the corridor. There were more of them than our simulations had predicted. Grace Whitfield's voice came through my earpiece, calm but tight with focus, confirming that the enemy had reinforced their position since the attack on Kepler's Rest, likely anticipating some kind of response from Earth, though clearly not one of this scale. I asked her if that changed anything. She told me it changed nothing except how satisfying this was going to be. Daniel Marsh's tactical AI, which the crew had taken to calling Longbow after the project that created it, began processing the enemy formation in real time, identifying patterns in their defensive posture that no human strategist could have spotted quickly enough on their own. Within seconds, it had mapped out every ship's likely firing arc, every gap in their coordinated shield coverage, every weakness a century of predictable warfare had allowed them to develop without ever being tested. Oliver gave the order to begin the approach in silence, engines running at reduced power, sensors dialed back just enough to avoid triggering early warning systems the Vashtar had installed throughout the corridor. We had studied their detection technology for years, and Daniel's teams had found a narrow window where our hulls, coated in materials developed specifically to absorb and scatter their scanning frequencies, could slip closer than any enemy species had ever managed before engaging. I watched the distance count down on the display, my heart pounding harder with every kilometer we closed, until finally an alarm rippled through the Vashtar formation, their ships scrambling into defensive positions as they realized, far too late, that an entire human fleet had appeared well within striking range. Oliver's voice rang out across the ship, steady and clear, giving the order that would change the galaxy forever. All ships, engage. What followed was unlike anything the Vashtar Dominion, or any species in that region of the galaxy, had ever experienced. Our kinetic weapons systems opened fire first, railguns built to fire solid projectiles at velocities their shield technology had never been designed to handle. I watched through the viewport as the first volley struck the nearest Vashtar cruiser, its shields flaring brightly as they tried to disperse the impact the way they always had against energy weapons, only to fail completely as raw kinetic force tore straight through their defenses and into the hull beneath. The cruiser's systems went dark within seconds, drifting silently out of formation, disabled rather than destroyed, because our strategy from the very beginning had been calculated and precise. Daniel's simulations had shown that crippling enemy ships, rather than annihilating them outright, would create chaos within their command structure, forcing surviving vessels to divert resources toward rescue and damage control instead of coordinated defense. It worked exactly as planned. Across the corridor, ship after ship found itself struggling against an enemy who refused to fight the way galactic warfare had always been fought. Vashtar gunners, trained for decades in long-range energy exchanges, found themselves overwhelmed by human pilots who closed distance rapidly, using speed and maneuverability to slip beneath their targeting systems before their weapons could properly track us. Nathan Cole's fighter squadron tore through the middle of the formation, weaving between larger vessels with a precision that came from years of atmospheric combat training back on Earth, a skill set most galactic pilots had never needed to develop since interstellar warfare rarely involved this kind of close, chaotic maneuvering. I heard Nathan's voice come through the comm system at one point, breathless but focused, reporting that the enemy pilots kept trying to maintain standard formation distances, refusing to adapt even as their formation collapsed around them, as though their training simply had no answer for what we were doing. That was the moment I finally understood what Daniel Marsh had meant, all those months ago in his briefing room, about a galaxy that had never fought an enemy who refused to fight fair. The Vashtar Dominion had built its military doctrine around centuries of conflict against species who all followed similar unwritten rules, engagements that unfolded at predictable distances using predictable weapons, wars that were almost ceremonial in their structure compared to the brutal efficiency Earth had refined across our own violent history. They had never needed to prepare for an enemy who studied their weaknesses for 15 years, while pretending to be too primitive to understand what they were looking at. As the battle progressed, Oliver ordered a group of specialized vessels forward, ships designed specifically for close-range boarding operations, a tactic so far outside modern galactic warfare that the Vashtar command structure seemed completely unprepared to respond to it. I watched on the display as these vessels latched onto the hull of a disabled Vashtar cruiser, breach charges cutting through the outer plating within seconds, deploying trained soldiers directly into the heart of the enemy ship. I thought of every history lesson from Earth's own violent past, every conflict that had shaped the tactics being used in that moment, and I felt a strange, heavy pride mixed with sorrow, understanding that everything terrible humanity had once done to itself was now being repurposed to defend us against a galaxy that had underestimated exactly how capable we truly were. Grace Whitfield's voice cut through the chaos of the bridge at one point, reporting that our shields were holding well beyond expected parameters, thanks to modifications her team had made based on years of studying alien weapon signatures. The Vashtar energy weapons, powerful as they were against other galactic species, had been calibrated for centuries against shield technology that worked in predictable, well-documented ways. Human engineers had spent years designing shield systems specifically to disrupt that predictability, absorbing and redistributing energy in patterns that confused their targeting computers. For nearly 2 hours, the battle raged across the Kesh corridor, and with every passing minute, the balance shifted further in our favor. Vashtar ships that had once formed an intimidating defensive wall now drifted disabled among the asteroid fields, their crews scrambling to maintain life support rather than continuing to fight, their command structure fractured by a strategy they had never encountered and clearly had no answer for. I stood on the bridge of the Valiant, watching Oliver Grant coordinate our fleet with the same steady calm he had carried since the moment we learned about Kepler's rest. And I thought about Laura Bennett's final message, about her hope that Earth would not let this be forgotten. I thought about the promise I had made to myself in that command tower back on Earth, and I felt, for the first time since receiving that terrible transmission, something close to peace. It was Daniel's voice that finally broke through the tension on the bridge, informing us that the Vashtar flagship, a massive vessel that had remained at the rear of the formation throughout the battle, was attempting to open a direct communication channel with the Valiant. Oliver looked at me, and I understood immediately what he was silently asking. I nodded, and the channel opened. The face that appeared on our display belonged to a Vashtar commander named Kriven Doss, a name I recognized from council briefings, a decorated officer with a reputation for ruthless efficiency who had overseen the destruction of Kepler's rest personally. His composure from our earlier conversation was gone entirely, replaced by something I had never seen on a Vashtar face before, a mixture of confusion and disbelief that seemed to leave him momentarily unable to speak. When he finally did speak, his voice carried none of the calm authority I remembered from before. He asked how a Tier 3 species had managed to dismantle an entire Vashtar defensive fleet within a matter of hours, a feat that, according to him, should have been impossible given everything the Council's records indicated about human military capability. I told him that the Council's records were built entirely on what humanity chose to show them, and that we had chosen, quite deliberately, to show them very little. He asked what it was we wanted. I told him that Kepler's rest had been home to 12,000 people who woke up every morning believing the galaxy operated under laws that protected them, laws the Vashtar Dominion had violated without hesitation and without remorse. I told him that humanity did not intend to destroy his species, because we were not interested in becoming the kind of empire that solved every disagreement through annihilation. But I told him, clearly and without any diplomatic softening, that his fleet would surrender immediately, that full reparations would be paid to Earth for the destruction of the colony, and that he personally would answer for his role in ordering the attack, whether through council law or through whatever process humanity deemed appropriate, if the council failed to act. There was a long silence on the other end of the channel. I watched Criven Doss glance briefly at something off-screen, likely a status report showing the true scale of his losses, before he looked back at the camera with an expression that I can only describe as the look of someone who had just realized how completely wrong he had been about the world around him. He agreed to the surrender. Across the corridor, one by one, the remaining Vashtar vessels began powering down their weapon systems, their shields dropping, their crews standing by to be boarded by human forces who moved through their disabled ships with the same discipline and restraint that had defined every part of our strategy from the very beginning. We did not destroy what we did not have to destroy. We did not kill anyone who had already surrendered. That restraint, I would come to understand later, would matter far more than the victory itself when it came time to answer for what had happened in the Kesh corridor before the Galactic Council. As the last Vashtar vessel powered down its weapons, I stood at the viewport of the Valiant, looking out over a battlefield scattered with disabled ships, debris drifting silently among the asteroids, and I felt none of the celebration I might have expected after such an overwhelming victory. I felt only the weight of everything it had taken to get here, the years of swallowed pride, the quiet preparation, the grief that had driven us toward this moment. I thought about Kepler's rest, about families who would never come home, about a promise made in a command tower that could never fully be kept, because nothing we did that day could bring those 12,000 people back. But I also felt something else, something I had not expected to feel so strongly, a quiet, steady resolve that whatever happened next, whatever the Galactic Council decided to say or do in response to what we had just accomplished, humanity would never again be dismissed as harmless. We had spent 15 years being underestimated. That mistake had just cost the Vashtar Dominion an entire fleet, and somewhere far beyond the Kesh corridor, word of what happened here was already beginning to spread across a galaxy that was about to learn, for the very first time, exactly what humanity was truly capable of when we finally stopped holding back. I had walked into the Galactic Council chamber more times than I could count over the last 15 years, but nothing compared to the walk I took 3 weeks after the battle in the Kesh corridor. The last time I stood beneath that towering domed ceiling, I had been a diplomat asking for scraps of respect from species who barely acknowledged my presence. This time, I walked in as a representative of the fleet that had just dismantled one of their most powerful members without losing a single ship. The chamber felt different, though nothing about its architecture had changed. The same golden light still filtered down from the high windows, the same rows of delegate platforms curved around the central floor, each one representing a different species from across the galaxy. But the air itself seemed to carry a different weight, a tension I had never felt in that room before. Oliver Grant walked beside me, dressed in his formal uniform, along with Charlotte Pierce, Earth's senior diplomatic officer, who had spent the last 3 weeks preparing our formal statement with a precision that matched the discipline of the fleet itself. Behind us, a small honor guard of Earth's soldiers stood at attention, not as a show of aggression, but as a quiet reminder that humanity no longer needed to enter that chamber asking for permission to exist. The council delegates were already seated when we arrived, and I noted immediately how many of them refused to make eye contact as we crossed the chamber floor. Species that had spoken over me in past meetings, species that had once dismissed Earth's concerns with barely concealed impatience, now sat in a silence so complete that I could hear our own footsteps echoing off the chamber walls. Criven Doss was present as well, seated among a small delegation from the Vashtar Dominion, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled, though I could see traces of the same disbelief that had crossed his face during our final communication in the Kesh corridor. The council's presiding officer, a tall being named Thessaly Orn, from a species that had held significant influence over council proceedings for centuries, called the session to order with a voice that lacked its usual commanding confidence. I was given the floor to speak, and for a long moment, I simply stood there, looking out across a chamber full of beings who had spent 15 years underestimating everything my species was capable of. I began by describing Kepler's rest, not with anger, but with quiet, deliberate clarity. I spoke about the families who had lived there, about children who attended school in domes built to withstand meteor storms, about Laura Bennett and her final message to nieces who would now grow up without her. I watched several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats as I spoke, unable to meet my eyes. I reminded the chamber that the Vashtar Dominion had destroyed that colony over a minor dispute regarding mining compliance, an act carried out without warning, without negotiation, and without any attempt to resolve the matter through the very council laws this chamber claimed to uphold. I explained that Earth had responded, not out of a desire for conquest, but out of necessity, because a species that allows atrocities against its people to go unanswered invites nothing but further atrocities in the future. I described the battle in the Kesh corridor honestly, without exaggeration, explaining that our fleet had specifically avoided unnecessary destruction, disabling rather than annihilating enemy vessels wherever possible, accepting surrender the moment it was offered, and treating captured Vashtar crews with the same standards of decency that council law required of any signatory species. I let that fact hang in the air for a long moment, because I wanted every delegate in that chamber to understand something clearly. Humanity had just demonstrated overwhelming military capability, and had still chosen restraint, a choice that stood in stark contrast to the unprovoked destruction of an entire civilian colony. Then I laid out our terms. I stated that Earth demanded formal recognition as a sovereign Tier 1 power within Council governance, a status that reflected our actual capabilities rather than the outdated classification the Council had assigned us based on nothing more than the size of our territory. I stated that the Vashtar Dominion owed full reparations to Earth for the destruction of Kepler's Rest, calculated not merely in resources, but in genuine, verifiable commitments to prevent such actions from ever being repeated against any species under Council protection. And finally, I stated that the entire tiered classification system, the very framework that had allowed a stronger species to dismiss the concerns of a smaller one for over a century, needed to be re-examined, because a system that permitted atrocities to go unanswered simply due to a difference in classification tier was not a system built on justice. It was a system built on convenience for those already in power. When I finished speaking, the chamber fell into a silence unlike anything I had ever experienced within those walls. 15 years of meetings, and I had never once heard that room go completely quiet, not even during the most contentious trade disputes between rival empires. Thessaly Orn sat motionless at the head of the chamber, and for a long moment, I genuinely believed no response would come at all. It was Kryven Doss who finally broke the silence, rising slowly from his seat among the Vashtar delegation. I braced myself for denial, for some attempt to minimize what his forces had done, the kind of diplomatic deflection I had grown used to expecting from species who rarely admitted fault openly. Instead, he spoke words I never expected to hear from a Vashtar commander. He acknowledged that the destruction of Kepler's Rest had been carried out under his direct authorization, and that he had underestimated humanity's capabilities so severely that his own fleet had paid the price for that miscalculation. He stated, with what sounded like genuine difficulty, that the Vashtar Dominion accepted responsibility for the attack and would not contest Earth's demand for reparations. I watched several other delegates exchange glances across the chamber, a ripple of quiet murmurs spreading through species who had clearly not expected such a direct admission. Thessaly Orn finally spoke, her voice measured but noticeably less commanding than I remembered from previous sessions. She stated that the Council would need time to formally review Earth's request for reclassification, explaining that such a significant change to galactic governance could not be decided within a single session. I told her that I understood the complexity of such a decision, but reminded the chamber that humanity had already demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what kind of power we represented. The only question remaining was whether the Council intended to formally acknowledge a reality that had already been proven on the battlefield, or whether they intended to cling to an outdated classification system out of nothing more than reluctance to admit they had been wrong about us for 15 years. Another long silence followed, and I noticed something shift in the expressions of several delegates seated around the chamber, particularly among species who themselves belonged to lower classification tiers. A few of them looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed at a human before. Not pity, not dismissal, something closer to hope. a delegate from a small species called the Mirren, a Tier 4 civilization that had suffered its own share of dismissive treatment from more powerful empires over the years, rose from her seat and asked to speak. Thessaly granted her the floor, and the Mirren delegate, a soft-spoken being named Alira Vosk, addressed the chamber with a quiet confidence I imagine had taken considerable courage to summon. She stated that her people had watched Earth's situation closely over the years, recognizing in it echoes of their own long history of being dismissed and overlooked by larger empires within council governance. She stated that what humanity had accomplished was not simply a military victory, but proof that the current classification system was fundamentally flawed, allowing stronger species to determine the value and treatment of smaller ones, based on nothing more than territorial size and fleet numbers, rather than actual capability or character. Her words seemed to embolden several other smaller delegations across the chamber, and for the first time in 15 years, I watched species who had always sat quietly during council sessions begin speaking up, voicing concerns about the same tiered system that had allowed Kepler's rest to happen in the first place. Thessaly Orn called for order, clearly attempting to regain control of a session that had shifted far beyond what she had anticipated when it began. She announced that the Council would convene a formal review of both Earth's reclassification request and the broader concerns regarding tiered governance, promising a decision within the coming months. It was not everything I had hoped to achieve in that single session, but it was more than I had truly expected. 15 years of being spoken over, dismissed, and quietly underestimated had just been answered, not with more diplomatic patience, but with undeniable proof of exactly what humanity was capable of, and a demand for justice that an entire chamber full of powerful species had been forced to sit and listen to in complete silence. As the session ended and delegates began filing out of the chamber, I noticed several of them approaching Charlotte Pierce and Oliver Grant, species who had never once initiated conversation with human representatives before, now asking quiet questions about Earth, about our history, about how a species so often dismissed had managed to accomplish what we had. I stood near the center of that chamber for a long moment after most delegates had left, looking up at the golden light filtering down from the high windows, thinking about everything it had taken to reach this moment. 15 years of swallowed pride, a colony that could never be brought back, a battle fought with precision and restraint against an enemy who had shown us none. The Galactic Council, an institution that had spent over a century determining the fate of species based on nothing more than convenient classifications, had finally been forced into a silence that spoke louder than any words they could have offered. They had underestimated humanity for the last time. 6 months passed between that session in the Galactic Council chamber and the day the formal ruling finally arrived, and in that time, the galaxy I had known for 15 years changed in ways I never could have predicted when I first walked into that chamber as a quiet, patient diplomat asking for scraps of respect. I spent those months traveling between Earth and the Council's central hub, watching the ripple effects of the Kesh corridor spread across systems I had once believed paid no attention to humanity at all. News of the battle had reached every corner of Council space within weeks, carried not through official channels, but through the kind of word that travels fastest of all, the word of species who had watched a smaller, dismissed civilization stand up to one of the galaxy's most respected military powers and win without losing a single ship. Grace Whitfield remained on Earth during most of that time, continuing her work at the Cheyenne shipyard, though the secrecy that had once surrounded her research was no longer necessary. I visited her once during those months, and she showed me new designs already taking shape, ships built not for hidden preparation, but for a future where humanity no longer needed to hide what we were capable of. She told me something during that visit that stayed with me. She said that for years, she had built weapons and defenses, believing they might never be needed, hoping that all that quiet preparation would simply sit unused, a deterrent rather than a necessity. She admitted that watching those ships finally deployed at Kepler's rest had been the hardest and most necessary thing she had ever done, and that she hoped humanity would never again need to build in secret out of fear that the galaxy would dismiss us if they knew our true capabilities. Daniel Marsh's work took on a very different purpose in those months as well. Instead of studying alien fleets for weaknesses in preparation for a war we hoped would never come, his teams began working directly with Council engineers, sharing select portions of human military doctrine as part of new cooperative defense agreements being negotiated between Earth and several smaller species who had reached out following the events in the Kesh corridor. Alira Vosk, the Mirren delegate whose words had shifted the tone of that first council session, became one of the strongest advocates for the reforms we had demanded. She visited Earth personally during those months, the first official visit from a Mirren representative in the history of our relationship with the Council, and I watched her walk through cities that had once seemed impossibly small and primitive by galactic standards, genuinely curious rather than dismissive, asking questions about human history and culture with the kind of respect I had waited 15 years to receive from anyone outside our own solar system. She told me during that visit that her people had begun quietly reaching out to other Tier 3 and Tier 4 species across Council space, species who had spent generations being spoken over and dismissed in exactly the way humanity once had been. She explained that Earth's victory had done something no amount of diplomatic argument ever could have accomplished. It had proven, undeniably, that classification tiers reflected nothing more than which species happened to have more ships and more territory, not which species deserved respect, dignity, or protection under Council law. Word of these growing alliances reached the Council's more powerful members quickly, and I could sense, during my visits to the Central Hub, a shift in how many of the larger delegations began treating not just Earth, but every smaller species that had once accepted quiet dismissal as simply the way things were. The formal ruling finally came on a day I will remember clearly for the rest of my life. I stood once again in that towering chamber, beside Oliver Grant and Charlotte Pierce, watching Thessaly Orn rise to deliver the Council's decision after 6 months of review, and, I suspected, considerable internal disagreement among species who had built their entire influence around the old system. The Council formally recognized Earth as a sovereign Tier 1 power, granting humanity full voting rights within Council governance for the first time in our history. The Vashtar Dominion was ordered to complete substantial reparations to Earth, not simply in resources, but in binding commitments overseen by an independent review body to prevent similar atrocities from occurring again. Criven Doss, who had shown genuine remorse throughout the months of review, faced formal consequences under Council law, a small measure of accountability that could never undo what had happened at Kepler's Rest, but which mattered deeply to the families who had lost everyone they loved that day. And finally, the Council announced the beginning of a full review of the tiered classification system itself, a process that Thessaly Orn admitted, with what I believed was genuine reluctance, had likely needed reform for far longer than anyone in that chamber had been willing to acknowledge. I did not celebrate when the ruling was announced. I simply stood there, thinking about Laura Bennett's final message, about a promise made in a command tower that could never be fully kept, but which had, in its own imperfect way, finally been honored. In the weeks that followed, I watched something remarkable begin to unfold across Council space. Smaller species that had spent generations accepting quiet dismissal as simply the way the galaxy worked, began reaching out to Earth directly, not out of pity or curiosity, but seeking genuine alliance with a species that had proven both its strength and its restraint when that strength was finally used. I remember standing on the observation deck of the Valiant one evening, months after the ruling, watching Earth's new fleet expand under open skies rather than hidden construction domes, no longer a secret the galaxy did not know existed, but a genuine, respected military power operating in full view of species who once believed us harmless. Oliver Grant joined me on that deck, and we stood together in comfortable silence for a while before he finally spoke. He told me that his sister, Laura, would have been proud of what humanity had built, not simply the ships or the weapons, but the choice to use overwhelming strength with restraint, to demand justice rather than revenge, to fight for a better galaxy rather than simply conquering a piece of it. I thought about everything it had taken to reach that moment. 15 years of swallowed pride and quiet preparation. A colony that could never be brought back, no matter how thorough the reparations or how sincere the apologies. A battle fought with precision against an enemy who had shown us none, and a council chamber that had finally been forced into a silence that spoke louder than any words they could have offered. We had spent 15 years being underestimated, dismissed as harmless, patronized by species who mistook our patience for weakness and our quiet preparation for primitive ignorance. That mistake had cost the Vashtar Dominion an entire fleet, and it had cost the Galactic Council the comfortable certainty that they alone decided which species deserved respect among the stars. Humanity had never wanted war. We had simply refused to accept a galaxy where atrocities against our people went unanswered, where our worth was measured by outdated classifications rather than genuine character and capability. As I looked out at Earth's fleet, now operating openly among the stars for the first time in our history, I understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. A galaxy that had once overlooked us, now watched carefully, and species who had once been dismissed alongside us, now looked to Earth with something I had waited my entire diplomatic career to see directed at humanity. Not pity, not dismissal, respect. And as the stars stretched out endlessly before me, I made a quiet promise. The same promise I had made in that command tower months earlier, that whatever came next for humanity among the stars, we would never again allow ourselves to be dismissed as harmless, and we would never forget the 12,000 souls whose loss had finally forced an entire galaxy to sit up, take notice, and listen. The Galactic Council had learned its lesson. Humanity was no longer waiting to be noticed. We had arrived, and the stars themselves would remember it.